kickoff session for our new 6-part series called The Forum for a New Central. We will be diving into the future of our city, beginning with today's session all about the evolution of the CBD, our historic and primary CBD of Central. Hopefully this will be a visual feast for you all. We're delighted to be joined by Andrew Ness and Christine Lowe. I want you all to tune in for our monthly webinars in the months to come, as well as next week's special session at the ULI Hong Kong conference, which is happening on Thursday, October 8th, where I will be joined on studio in session with Nigel Smith from Colliers. So without further ado, we have a lot to cover. So I'd like to bring up Andrew so he can start his presentation. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much. Thanks, Tiffany. So this talk is called Hong Kong Central District, the Enduring Value of Place. Let me just... Yeah, the table of contents, the agenda. So in today's talk, we're going to discuss the early development, the urban development of early Hong Kong. And we're not going to do it really in terms of a chronological unfolding of events, but rather in terms of 5 conceptual groupings, which I've listed here in the agenda. And the first 3, 2, 3, and 4, really relate to the emergence of certain key functions in the early British period. And the latter 2 relate to major harbor reclamations and road development projects, which gave rise to the mature early CBD. Looking at this really interesting 1930s aerial view of course Statue Square CBD, the massive buildings that we see were actually collectively embodied Britain's colonial power. I don't have time now to read the names of every single building, but this was really remarkable in the sense that, like other former British colonial cities in Asia, the urban plan, which this represented a kind of social hierarchy made visible. And early British Hong Kong's urban plan, taken in its entirety, represented a kind of technology of ruling, with its substantial military presence, undergirded by frequent displays of the spectacle of empire. So let me talk very briefly about the structure of the presentation. The way I see Hong Kong, early British Hong Kong, as having these A, B, C, D, and E groups. The A group is the prison, police station, magistrate group. It was the first group to emerge. The B group is really a group which is organized around Government House, the Cathedral, Botanical Gardens, and Peak Tram. The C group is basically the military cantonment. There's an enormous area, the military cantonment. The D group I relate to the Praya Reclamation Phase 1, which allowed the Naval Road to emerge. And the E group is the second reclamation from 1878 to, excuse me, from the 1878 to 1904, which in fact enabled the construction of Colonial Road and the completion of the land reclamation, which allowed the final CBD to be built, that we're going to talk about in today's presentation. But anyhow, let's look first at that A grouping, which is very, very interesting. Which is the police, jail, and law court grouping. What I think is, and you can see this is a map detail on the screen from a very interesting 1925 map of Hong Kong, which identifies, it's not a very technically precise map, but it does identify all the key buildings and the polygons of the buildings that were on the important sites and names them. So that it's a very useful map. The Victoria Jail, let me go backwards. The Victoria Jail is remarkable because it was constructed in 1841, only 7 months after the British flag was raised on Possession Point. Why were the British, in fact, it was the first building built in Hong Kong of granite and brick, the first sort of permanent building. One thing which is interesting to think about, what was the haste to build this prison so quickly? If you read the histories of the Hong Kong right after Possession Street was claimed, historians talk about the Wild West atmosphere which prevailed in the early colony. And in fact, in 1842, things were so bad that the British had to impose a nighttime curfew, mostly on the movements of Chinese residents. So the early colony was quite unsettled. The Central Magistracy was built 5 years later in 1847. The Central Police Station, was not built until actually 1864, 17 years later. And the construction of the Central Police Station really coincided with a complete reorganization and expansion of the Hong Kong police. We'll talk about that more in a moment. These are fantastic photographs because the photograph of the interpreter's dinner, police interpreter's dinner in 1903, and the cartoon from the 1882 Illustrated magazine showing the arrest of a rickshaw driver by a Sikh constable in the Royal Police Force really reminds us that the early criminal justice system created a lot of offenses that were only applicable to Chinese people. In fact, it was very bewildering to them, many of them not really speaking English very well. And so I think that if you look not only at the buildings, but also at the photographs and drawings from the period, it brings home what a difficult place this was. And of course, the interpreters worked at the complicated interface between the colonial legal system and the Chinese population. I can't dwell on this slide for too long, but it's also these photographs of the early prison wardens, the interior of the Victoria Prison, and the early 20th century prison yard with the wardens and a drill. The photograph on the extreme left-hand side, the wardens were divided into a total of 5 different categories based on their ethnicity and also based on their language. A for Europeans, B for Indians, C for local Chinese, D for Mandarin-speaking Chinese from Shandong, and finally E for white Russians who emigrated from after the Russian Revolution. I mean, this just gives us a sense of how hierarchical the early colony was. So another thing which is remarkable about the early prison complex, this is a famous photograph of the police drill in front of the early police station, was that in fact, in Hong Kong, although the early police force was really of dubious quality and very under strength, in the 1860s, the whole police force was reorganized. And in fact, after the reorganization, it constituted one of the largest police forces in the British Empire in relationship to the relative size of Hong Kong. This police station, we tend to forget now because it's a small, older building, but it was built on top of Taiping Hill, Taiping Shan, and it overlooked the Chinese residential district right below. And then for Chinese people looking up toward the hill, it was a rather intimidating presence. And it not only was it intimidating, but it rose from the top of a very remarkable, forbidding granite retaining wall, and that further underscored this sort of slightly threatening effect. So having very, very briefly dealt with this very early emerged police and prison and court complex, let's talk about the emerging center of government authority. I want to talk about the construction of Government House and the Botanical Garden, which is a fascinating subject. The Peak Tram is also related to it, as is the Anglican Cathedral. So besides facilitating military and police control over the new colony, many of the buildings that were built in the very early British period were meant to display British mercantile power for sure. And the imposing neoclassical style in which buildings like Government House were built referenced right back to England and right back to London, and they drew upon the sort of majestic power of the metropole. Construction of Government House launched in 1851, completed in 1855 by John Bowring. We see that in the next slide. This slide on the right-hand side is the very early Government House. The right-hand side, the current Government House. The tower on top was remodeled by the Japanese during the period of occupation. But one thing which is also remarkable is that I talked about surveillance and Taiping Shan Police Station, Central Police being on a hill. Well, Government House was also on a hill, and it was on the top of the hill, the sloping hill of the Central District. And it really permitted the early governor to have a view of the entire waterfront. Now, by the 1950s, this view began to recede, and then really toward the 70s, 80s, and 90s. In fact, in the 1990s, I think that the Government House now only has a very clear view of the glass curtain wall of Chung Kong Center, BOC, and Tea Garden Road. So it's now been dwarfed by all the surrounding development. But in its heyday, it was a very imposing building. Another thing which we tend to forget is that the early British governors were not ceremonial figures. They were very powerful. And they were the titular commander of the British forces in Hong Kong. They were at the apex of the colonial social hierarchy, and they linked it directly to the mother company, the sovereign, and the empire. So and also, I mean, the British early governors controlled patronage. They also controlled who was invited to Government House, which is a very important, a very important power. So it was only natural that when visiting dignitaries came to Hong Kong, they were always received on the steps of the Government House. On the left-hand side, we have a photograph of Governor Lugard receiving a delegation from Beijing, Prince Tsai, in 1909, and then 13 years later, Governor Stubbs receiving Edward VII, the Prince of Wales, on his royal visit to Hong Kong. When the British came to Hong Kong in the 1840s, they brought with them not merely a passion for gardening, but a determination to actually replicate full scale the greenery of England in their new colony at the mouth of the Pearl River. It was actually John Bowring who built the Government House, who also built the Botanical Garden, which is directly to the north of Government House. So it's not surprising, given this fact that it's really a replica, that the early Botanical Gardens was really catered more to the needs of resident European people. It was an ideal place to promenade on Sunday to the strains of military bands, but it also attracted some Chinese visitors. So there's a remarkable photograph. This must have been taken before 1911, of a group of Chinese men visiting, sort of shyly visiting the Botanical Garden, and you can see from their pigtails that this is before the Qing Dynasty was overthrown. Anyhow, I view the Botanical Garden as really an adjunct to Government House. It was sort of it was a very sort of inevitable sort of accessory for Government House. It was something that was sort of very necessary. And then this also relates, so the Government House, the Botanical Garden, also relate to the St. John's Cathedral. Because one thing which is interesting about St. John's Cathedral is that it was built in 1849, fully 6 years before Government House. It was built by Governor John Davis. I think he was the second governor of Hong Kong. And it was to replace a temporary structure on the former site of the French Mission building. But anyhow, this early St. John's Cathedral, in fact, is still the existing St. John's Cathedral, was built with donations from the Anglican community in Hong Kong, which is matched by the British Colonial Office in London, who, when they finally saw the bill, were shocked and very unhappy that they had spent so much money. They felt it was far too costly, and the scale was far too grand for the early colony. In fact, this London's reluctance to underwrite the colony's development and operations is a persisting theme throughout the entire British colonial period. And then, of course, we see the picture of the St. John's Cathedral today with the HSBC and Standard Chartered Bank rising behind it. So having talked about these two functional groupings, let me talk about the military cantonment very briefly, which is also a very interesting subject. Within an area, and you can see this on the map very clearly, you can see the Murray Barracks on the map, right? The Victoria Barracks, military quarters, the military hospital, it's all very clear on the map, and also the Royal Navy dockyard. But what I want to emphasize is that within a very small area, only 2 square kilometers in what is today's Central Admiralty, Tamar, was situated the entire control and command structure of the Royal British Army and Navy, and also a lot of the actual armed forces as well. The Victoria Barracks was one of the first British military installations built within the military cantonment, and construction was begun in the 1840s. So the Victoria Barracks, together with the Murray Barracks, Wellington Barracks, Naval Docks, were key components in this military cantonment, which occupied, in fact, most of the sloping land in Central, running right down to the water's edge. And another thing which is interesting, which we don't think about, when you go for a stroll in Hong Kong Park, you don't think about what was there, 100 years ago. But in fact, the Victoria Barracks, the 30 buildings, occupied really the entire Hong Kong Park, the place which is now occupied by Pacific Place, and also the Queensway government offices. So it was quite substantial. Another interesting thing is the present site of the Chung Kong building, Chung Kong Center, was formerly, it's a very substantial site, was formerly a parade grounds, the Murray Parade Grounds. And the British frequently held military parades on the parade grounds with bands playing, military marches, visiting dignitaries, inspecting the troops. And we have a great photograph, not only of a 1920s parade on the Murray Parade Grounds, but one thing which a photograph I didn't present is that in fact, not only were British troops from the British Royal Army paraded, but also the British paraded troops, the Pathan, Bengali, Punjabi, and Gurkha troops. And this really instilled in the Chinese population of Hong Kong that this Anglo-Indian military force that was defending the interest of Hong Kong was the army of an empire in which the sun would never set. Another thing which is very interesting too is the whole history of Flagstaff House. We don't have time to go into it in great depth, but one thing which I found very interesting in doing the research to provide this presentation is that the Flagstaff House was built in 1846, which is fully 9 years before Government House, and it was Major General Saltoun who chose the location and who had it built. So the fact that this actually preceded the construction of Government House suggests to me that in the colony's early existence, the real top dog was not the colonial governor, but was rather the general officer commanding. And then in this slide, we have on the right-hand side an interesting photograph of Lieutenant Cameron Somerville on a picnic with his wife Bessie and the wives of other senior officers in the Royal British Army in a location very close to the present Flagstaff House. Of course, the Flagstaff House in '89 was converted into a Museum of Tea Ware. You know, and also for people who say that Hong Kong doesn't conserve very much of its past, actually of the 30 barracks buildings in the Victoria Barracks, 5 of the finest buildings have been conserved, and they've been conserved for various uses. We have some photographs here on the left-hand side of two of the 5 conserved buildings. They've been conserved for a visual arts center, an aviary support center, a psychiatric rehabilitation center, a luxury housing complex, and also the management office of Hong Kong Park and the marriage registry. But I don't want to leave out the history of the British Navy, which is also very important and also had a huge impact on the area which is now Admiralty Tamar. In 1854, the British Navy acquired a site for use as its naval dockyard, roughly where the main MTR station now sits. The main Admiralty MTR station now sits on Queensway. But by the time of the Second Opium War, which erupted in 1856, this triggered a really rapid acceleration of the buildup of British naval forces in Hong Kong. So increasingly, they began running out of space for ship repair. And so they managed to make do until finally in 1902, they just really had to expand more. And what this did is it triggered, because they couldn't buy land around their existing naval dockyards, they were forced to reclaim the harbor. And they engaged in a massive reclamation project to create a whole new east arm of the expanded dockyard, the floating naval dockyard. And this was in fact an important early activity kicking off the reclamation in the areas of what is today's Tamar waterfront, where after further expansion, eventually the Hong Kong central government complex was built. So now in this presentation, I'm going back quite quickly. We've talked about these 3 sort of functional nodes. Having spoken about the 3 functional nodes, I want to talk about 2 waves of reclamation, 2 big reclamation initiatives, which taken collectively between 1858 and 1904, really created the land on which the early CBD was built. So let's talk about the early reclamation. It was launched by Governor John Bowring, who was a real kind of mover and shaker. And he wanted to build a road running all along the seafront of the city of Victoria, from where Saiwan is today to what was called East Point, Dongguk. It's now Causeway Bay. But ironically, although Bowring was very enthusiastic, his plan met with very fierce opposition from a lot of the big merchant houses, because they had sold many marine lots along the seafront. Somewhat earlier, 10 years earlier, and actually in 1841, they sold a lot of these marine lots. And the merchant houses had built many docks, and also they had also legally and illegally engaged in a lot of reclamation. So when Bowring came to them with a plan to build this massive new seawall and more reclamation, they didn't like it at all. But being a diplomat, he basically didn't want to lock horns with this very powerful group of trading houses. So he began doing reclamation in what is now the Western District, the Chinese populated Western District, and only circled back on doing reclamation in Central later. So by the 1878, he had created what was initially called Bowring Praya Road West and Bowring Praya Road Central. And this expansion and the creation of Praya Road, in fact, paved the way for the establishment of the first city hall in Hong Kong, and also for the HSBC building, and a cluster of buildings which were of other bank buildings that were built around HSBC. So what we have here, this is a picture of Praya Road, the way it looked before Bowring's reclamation was completed, before Praya Road Central and Praya Road West were completed. And you can see the old go-down buildings. They were 2 to 3 stories. The lower stories used as warehouses, the upper stories used for residence or office. And this is what the whole waterfront looked like before the road was improved. Also, and this is another, once again, I'm sort of eliding and showing a lot of things in one slide. The history of the development of the 4 generations of the HSBC building really encapsulate the entire history of the CBD. You see on the left-hand side, the Wardley House. This is their first HSBC building, and it's the building on the extreme right-hand side of the photograph, which they occupied in 1865 before the improvement of Praya Road. And they used that until 1886 when they created a second HSBC building, the building with the dome in the second photograph. And it was the Praya Reclamation which enabled that. In 1933, they moved to another headquarters. Great, also all in the same location, by the way. They never really moved. This is always in the same place. This fantastic Art Deco building. It was the tallest building in Hong Kong at the time, the first air-conditioned building, which they built in 33. And in 1941, when the Japanese occupied Hong Kong, they liked it so much, they also made it their headquarters. They were so enamored with it. And this actually served as the headquarters of the bank until the late 70s, 78, 79, when they really ran out of space, which forced them to build the Foster and Partners building, which was completed in 1985. And another amusing anecdote is that I wasn't, you always see the HSBC building standing next to Standard Chart, but in fact, what I didn't realize until I prepared for this presentation is that the Standard Chartered building has always been next to the HSBC building. Standard Chartered actually opened in Hong Kong in 1859, and I have a photograph of one of their early headquarters buildings from 1908. But they were always cheek by jowl next to the HSBC building. So they've actually stood next together for more than 120 or 130 years. In fact, I don't know whether it's a positive synergy between 2 banks or sort of 2 athletes locked into some sort of a petrified image of 2 athletes locked into some sort of eternal competition. But interesting to think of them too, all these 2 banks always standing there together next to each other for 130 years. Another thing which is quite interesting is that by the 1870s, Hong Kong was really booming, and very well-heeled business travelers began to arrive in Hong Kong, and there was no really very good hotel to stay. So in 1868, a hotel was opened, the Hong Kong Hotel. It was at the intersection of Praya Road and Pedder Street, and it was by far the most sumptuous hotel in the colony at the time. In fact, it was modeled on luxury London hotels, and its location at Queen's Road and Pedder Street directly fronted on the waterfront. This building was later torn down in 1932 and redeveloped as the Gloucester Building. And the Gloucester Building was itself torn down in the late 70s, and then the site on which the Gloucester Building stands was incorporated by Hong Kong Land in the much larger landmark complex. So where the landmark is today, part of where the landmark is today was formerly the best hotel in Hong Kong, the Hong Kong Hotel. So having talked about the first reclamation, which one thing I neglected to say is that this Bowring Praya Road Central and Bowring Praya Road West were then later, around 1904, renamed Voeux Road in honor of the governor at the time. And so apart from the construction of Voeux Road, the second reclamation from 1890 to 1904 created a very important, first of all, by creating another very substantial piece of land, I believe 59 acres, if I'm not wrong. It permitted the development of another road running across the seafront, or the Harbourfront, a colonial road. And the second reclamation was very significant because it had a dramatic effect in recentering the core business district of Hong Kong and moving the waterfront right up the CBD, right up to Colonial Road. And within 7 years after the completion of this Praya Reclamation Phase 2, this area emerged as an extremely vital area in British Hong Kong with many commercial and government buildings and monuments, which we will shortly describe. So the next slide I have, and this is a fantastic photograph on the extreme left-hand side, is a photograph from the 1890s of the reclamation, actually 1890, of the second reclamation, which created Colonial Road and Statue Square area, actively in progress. That's the photo on the left. The photograph in the center is from 1896, And it shows when the reclamation was very well progressed, in fact, nearing completion, of a big military march and a celebration on the reclaimed site, which later became Statue Square. And then on the right-hand side, I have a photograph of Blake's Pier, which is a metal canopied pier that was reserved for the visits by royalty and other visiting dignitaries. And it led out directly onto a colonial road. So the colonial road also facilitated transportation as well and more ferry piers. But another thing which is remarkable about the construction of Statue Square, which was enabled by Colonial Road Second Reclamation, is that it created for what for Hong Kong was a very much needed new civic space. Now, in early British Hong Kong, a very carefully cultivated sense of hierarchy was the prevailing ideology of the empire, okay? And it was very, very much in evidence during royal visits to Hong Kong, all of which were played out on the stage of the new Statue Square. So we have here a photograph of Edward VII, the Prince of Wales, after he has arrived and disembarked on Blake's Pier, being carried on in a sedan chair along Connaught Road, accompanied by Governor Stubbs, who's walking with a ceremonial sword, pith helmet, and plume pith helmet. And the other photograph on the right shows his actual arrival, met by military bands and by marching troops. So in formation. So this also gives a sense of the grandeur and majesty of the Statue Square and place for the theater of the spectacle of empire. Now, the photograph on the left-hand side, we had to crop because it faded. There was a problem with the photograph fading on the left-hand side. So we had to crop out the image of the early statue of Queen Victoria. But this space, I really want to emphasize, was a really important new civic space in the heart of Central. So in 1896, a statue of Queen Victoria was unveiled, and we have a photograph. This is the photograph on the left with all the military, all the troops lined up in formation. And there was a huge ceremony when they unveiled the statue of Queen Victoria sitting in a cupola. And then I have a photograph from roughly 1 year later when the statue is already fully installed. And the Hong Kong Club, which is under construction in the earlier photograph, is now completely finished. And members of the early Hong Kong Club are looking out of the balcony at the military ceremony to commemorate the unveiling of the statue. But one thing which I think is very interesting and remarkable is that, in fact, after the statue of Queen Victoria was installed in the cupola, it wasn't the only statue that was placed in Statue Square. In fact, subsequently, statues of Prince Albert, Edward VII, George VI, and HSBC Chief Manager Sir Thomas Jackson were also unveiled on Statue Square. And I think it's a tremendous irony, actually, that nowadays, the only statue which remains on Statue Square is the statue of Sir Thomas Jackson, who was the first general manager of HSBC. So ironically, I think, in my own opinion, what remains in Statue Square is not a statue to British royalty, a sort of British royalty being a slightly faded sort of icon, but rather a statue which honors the rise of global capitalism. And it's not inappropriate given the trajectory along which Hong Kong subsequently evolved. Just to give you some other amusing anecdotes, the Japanese, when they invaded Hong Kong in 1941, they immediately grabbed the statue of Queen Victoria and removed it from the cupola. I guess they thought it was bad feng shui. They didn't want her there. And luckily, she wasn't melted down. The statue wasn't melted. And also, they removed the other statues. Today, Queen Victoria sits, you can see the extreme right-hand photograph, in Victoria Park near the Causeway Road entrance. Sits very quietly without her cupola. Statue of King George VI also survived and sits in a small niche in the Botanical Garden, but it's a remarkable statue. Another thing which is also interesting is that, so 1896, the statue of Queen Victoria was unveiled, and this really kind of centered Statue Square. That's why it's called Statue Square. Then 16 years later, the Hong Kong Supreme Court building was built, right diagonally across from the statue of Queen Victoria. And this was, of course, and still is, a very, very remarkable building with its classical architecture, impressive dome, and its massive granite pillars. And it was fraught with symbolism. And I think it further anchored Statue Square for sure. I mean, why is it so important? It's because the Supreme Court building in this location really represents the British rule of common law. And the British certainly hailed common law as one of the great virtues of the colony's existence. And they upheld common law, this legal system, throughout the unraveling of the Qing dynasty, the tempestuous Republican period, and the various ups and downs of the People's Republic. And so this was another thing which sort of justified empire and colony. The central photograph shows the Japanese who not only took the HSBC building, but also took this building for their military police and used it as an interrogation center as well as a police headquarters. This photograph from 1944 is for the end of the Japanese period when they, I guess, they were scared of being attacked by the resistance, so they surrounded the building with sandbags. Finally, the last comment I want to make about Statue Square is the cenotaph. When we look at the cenotaph today, and it also has a very remarkable history. It was first unveiled in 1923. We have a photograph of its unveiling. And it was, of course, initially a monument to the glorious dead of the First World War, and then later, after the Second World War, was a monument to the glorious dead of both World Wars. But when I look at the cenotaph, what it reminds me, what it strikes me, is that it really reminds me of what a highly Anglophile society was, the early colonial Hong Kong was. And it was also the very unveiling of the cenotaph, which is a replica of another cenotaph in Whitehall in London, was also a reminder to people in Hong Kong of Hong Kong's place as a territory amongst the British overseas dominions. The photograph on the right-hand side is actually from the same 1923 unveiling. It shows members of the Hong Kong Club from the balcony of the club, looking down on the unveiling ceremony. Two different photographs. So as we talk about a few other interesting aspects of early Central and particularly Statue Square area. In a book by, I believe it's Frank Welsh, The History of Hong Kong, he writes, the more relaxed society of Regency England, which had been reproduced in Canton and Macau, gave way in the colony of Hong Kong to a more self-conscious striving for gentility. So one thing which is quite interesting is when the British staked out their claim to Hong Kong in 1841, they brought with them all the accoutrements of genteel society in England. This includes gentlemen's clubs, Anglican Cathedral, Grand Hotel, botanical gardens, cricket greens, and a mountaintop summer retreats. But another kind of remarkable fact is that the British Club in Hong Kong was built only 5 years after Sir Edward Belcher planted the British flag on Possession Point. It opened in actually 1846, although in the early years it didn't have a formal clubhouse. They had to wait until 1873 to have a first generation clubhouse. And this clubhouse, in fact, was built exactly where the entertainment building now stands, at the intersection of Wyndham Street and Queens Road Central. Then 17 years later, they moved to another temporary clubhouse on Daglar Street and didn't move into their really grand new clubhouse at number 1 Jackson Road until 1897. And in fact, the cricket green was right in front of the Hong Kong Club. Many members of the club were also members of the cricket club, so the whole thing was quite convenient. So in fact, they stayed there until the late 1970s. And by the early 1980s, it was clear that they wanted to build another clubhouse. There was a tremendous, many people wanted to retain the old building, but finally money won out, and Hong Kong Lab made a very interesting proposal about redeveloping the Hong Kong Club. So in 1984, I believe, the new Hong Kong Club opened. Another point, which is also interesting, is that cricket. I mean, cricket was, particularly in 19th century Britain, during the height of the Victorian Empire, it represented a very noble game, right? It was a manly game, a gentleman's game, and popularizing cricket amongst a certain class of people perfectly supported the ethos of British colonial Hong Kong. So the old cricket club was situated right in front of the Supreme Court building on the northeast corner of the building. We have a great photograph, people playing cricket in front of the club, the Hong Kong Club behind, from probably the 1960s. And then in 1970, the entire area was rezoned for public use. And so the cricket pitch was in fact what is now Chater Garden. And the rezoning for public use and civic use for this private space prompted the club to move to Wong Nai Chun, which they did in the early 70s. But what I love in this sequence of photographs is a photograph from 1967 of the members of the cricket club playing cricket on the green, on the area which is now Chater Garden, right in front of the Bank of China building. So 1967 was when China was becoming engulfed by the Cultural Revolution. And so the people running the bank in Hong Kong, being a British colony, wanted to clearly show their loyalty to the Gang of Four and the new ruling the people now who had taken charge of the Cultural Revolution. So they draped banners on front of the building, neon signs, a big placard with Mao Zedong's picture. There were certainly loudspeakers blaring revolutionary music and propaganda. But what I love is this picture of the members of the cricket club just continuing to play cricket, just batting on and sort of keeping a stiff upper lip, despite all the tremendous sort of uproar coming from the Bank of China building. It's a wonderful photograph and rather a famous one too. I'm winding down the presentation now, but another thing about Statue Square, apart from the Supreme Court and the Cenotaph and the Queen Victoria statue and all the clubhouses, another thing which we want to really emphasize is this was, in fact, the earliest CBD, Central Business District in Hong Kong. And some of the largest and grandest early office buildings were built right on this site. So we talked about the second Praya Reclamation enabling the construction of Praya Road. Well, of Cornwall Road. Well, another thing which it enabled by creating a space of 59 acres, it permitted the development of the Queen's Building, which opened in 1897. And it was a huge commercial building. It was labeled, it's described as an architectural jewel of neoclassical grace. But in fact, it was one of the largest commercial buildings in Hong Kong at the time, housed overseas shipping companies, insurance and trading companies, and in fact lasted until the early 1960s, when it was finally demolished and replaced by the Mandarin Oriental Hotel, which opened in 63. It was one of the first, Queen's Building was one of the first buildings you saw when you arrived by ferry at one of the piers on Cornwall Road. And it was very, very close to another building, the Prince's Building, which is also probably the first pure office building in early British Hong Kong. And this building, this four-story building, was occupied mostly by law firms and a few Asian banks. The law firms that were tenants included Deakins and Johnson, Stokes and Master. And amusingly, most of these law firms, if they're not in the Prince's Building, they're not very far away in the Alexandra House or in other nearby properties. So they haven't gone very far in 120 years. And we see the Prince's Building as it reopened in 1965, right below. It's the second generation. Anyhow, I want to wind down my presentation by saying, in a nutshell, so what's the legacy? I mean, so the British Hong Kong, if you subtract 4 years for the period of Japanese occupation, lasted for 173 years. And what is the legacy of all this? And of the extreme concentration of development which they had in Central, control and command and commercial facilities, all these things. One direct result of the legacy is the area serves as location for Hong Kong central government offices, the Chinese PLA Forces Building, the Hong Kong Police Headquarters on Arsenal Street, and the Supreme Court Building and Final Appeals Building. But I think an equally important legacy is that it's still really the undisputed financial center of Hong Kong. It's the headquarters of 149 financial institutions, including HSBC and Standard Chartered, and all the leading mainland Chinese banks, ICBC, BOC, ABC, and CCB, all still here. So what does the future hold for this place? It's very interesting to speculate because Hong Kong certainly is changing and more new business districts are emerging. I leave you with this picture showing the transformation from 1870 to 2020 in a series of photographs. Don't know if the future will have such a tremendous transformation, but maybe this would lead on to maybe Christine talking a little bit about some scenarios for what the future might hold for Central. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Well, Andrew, I just completely loved your presentation. Let me just share 4 brief thoughts with everyone. The first point to make is when the British took over Hong Kong as a colony, this was a moment of major historical geopolitical shift of its time. So again, now that we're talking about today and what Hong Kong and Central might be, I think we can all agree that we're sitting on another major period of time where there's a geopolitical shift that relates to China. Now, when the British came, Andrew, you showed us the early action was really an assertion of power. So the assertion of power was shown, first of all, about police and law, because that was the urgency. And I wondered, now that we're in 2020, whether again we can see if today is a transition, then the assertion of power from the sovereign is something that happens. And we're not talking about whether it's good or bad. It is a natural act to assert the power as you see the problem might be of the day. Then there came the church, then came government and military, and very important because Hong Kong was about trade and finance. So that's my first point, the visible assertion of power. The second point I want to make is the visual aspect of the assertion of power and the relative importance of these structures. So the first point, Andrew, you showed is government's power and its criminal justice power was on top of a mountain. So as you said, that was important because where you sit physically in any location is important. And for those who asserted power, to be lifted up a bit somewhere, looking down, was a physical manifestation of power. Well, the other thing was, well, the others who obviously was not political power, but financial power, they occupied very important places in Hong Kong as well. So you showed HSBC headquarters, you showed Standard Chartered Bank, but we mustn't forget, actually, Bank of China, the old building is still there. And when these buildings were built, Bank of China was really very modern. It too had a building of the era that matched the old HSBC building. So the point that I want to make is the visual impact of the relative positioning of hard power by government and also other power of finance and trade was also right next to it. The third point I want to make is, well, time is shifting. Let us not forget that after Britain took Hong Kong as a colony, then the next phase was actually in Kowloon, and then the next phase after that was the new territories. So if we took a look from today, what we see is the shifting of focus further and further inland, although Central remained the power base of the colonial government. But after 1997 and beyond the new territories, we now have the Greater Bay Area. And I think we can see that obviously a lot more activity will be linked with the mainland of China. And this shift of people, of population, of activities, of opening up transport towards the mainland, this is obviously something that has been happening for some time. The last point I want to make is maybe touch on the future. Now, in 1997, something interesting happened. Let us not forget, our first chief executive decided not to live in Government House. Now, I think people talked about it at the time, but if you see it in maybe the longer flows of history, do we look back and say that actually the seat of political power have moved? They've moved away from Central. Central government office is now in Tamar, and the complementary building of Wan Chai Tower, Immigration Tower, actually all those are going to shift. Then also this concentration of power in one place versus a more dispersed power, government officers going into different places. That's another trend that is happening. The other thing, of course, is population shift. In the new territories, that's where population is rising. In fact, the population of Hong Kong Island itself is frozen, or maybe it will even come down a bit. So the question for the future is, what will Central be? Even the financial power, the buildings are there, but thinking of the future of the banking transformation itself, going from big institutions maybe to, you know, the Bitcoin bit of the world. How will that shift? And no doubt the financial sector itself is having to face that kind of challenge. Also on Hong Kong Island, can we imagine, because of climate change, that all these buildings that we see, even beyond Central, well, maybe you won't be tearing them down anymore. So is the future about redesign, retrofit, and is it in terms of the Central area and also the upper area of Central, which is what we call mid-levels, is this going to be a place to be a part of Hong Kong Island where you have lower population? Is this going to be the most desirable part of Hong Kong as it goes forward? Or is this going to be the part that is going to be less linked to where the action is, so to speak, the Greater Bay Area? I don't know what the answer is, but I think it's so wonderful that ULI is putting together a series to think about the transformation of Central and what it could be, with both a historical perspective, but also looking forward to see how to redesign this place for the people. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Andrew and Christine for that very rich look back into our history, as well as leaving us with a lot of food for thought about the future for a new Central. Again, thank you everyone for joining us for this first kickoff session for the forum, and I look forward to seeing you all next week at the ULI Hong Kong conference on October 8th, as well as subsequent sessions we'll be hosting on a monthly basis until March of next year. All right, have a great day and thanks again. Bye-bye.